There is a way of looking at a map that most people never learn. Not the skill of reading terrain, contour lines, elevation, the relationship between drainage and ridge. That skill is taught and learned, and anyone who spends enough time in the backcountry develops some version of it. The way of looking at a map that most people never learn is the way of reading a map for what it doesn't show, for the absences, for the places where the notation becomes sparse and the named features thin out and the map becomes, in a specific way, quiet. Southern Oregon is quiet on maps in this sense, not the whole of it. The Cascades are well documented. The coastline is well mapped. The Rogue River has been navigated and noted, and its character is encoded in the literature of the region. But in the interior, in the specific stretch of terrain between the western foothills of the Cascades and the edge of the Siskiyou Uplift, there are places where the map simply doesn't have much to say. The contour lines are there. The drainages are marked. The few roads that penetrate this country are noted. But the features, the named places, the points of human reference that populate most American wilderness maps, the peaks with names, the lakes with names, the passes with names that tell you someone thought them worth naming. In that specific interior stretch, they thin out. In the 40-mile radius that this episode is concerned with, there are almost none. People have been going into that terrain and not coming back since at least 1974. 11 of them that the documentation records. The actual number, if you include the cases that were handled without formal SAR involvement, the hunters who drove in alone and didn't drive out, the people whose families did not report them as missing to the right authorities, the deaths that were attributed to conventional causes without full investigation, is almost certainly larger. What the record shows is 11. And what the record shows about those 11 is the pattern that this series has been building toward. Not 11 separate accidents, 11 instances of the same specific wrongness, in the same specific 40 miles, over 50 years. The earliest documented case in the cluster is from September of 1974. A man in his late 40s went deer hunting alone in the interior terrain. He had hunted this area before, not frequently, but he knew it enough to be comfortable going in without a partner. He was expected back on a Sunday evening. He did not return Sunday. His truck was found at the informal pullout where hunters parked on the following Tuesday morning, discovered by another hunter who had used the same spot earlier in the season. The county sheriff's office organized a search. The terrain in question was dense mixed forest at moderate elevation, with several drainages cutting through it and rocky outcrops on the higher ground. The search ran for 5 days and covered the most likely terrain based on where he had hunted before and where a man moving on foot through this country would most naturally go. They found nothing. No body, no gear, no blood, no physical evidence of any kind that he had been in the terrain at all. His truck was there. His license and his tag were verified. He had been there. He had gone somewhere. The search was formally suspended after 5 days. The case was listed as a missing person. It has never been closed. He was the first. He would not be the last. The pattern across all 11 cases does not become visible until you look at them together. This is the specific challenge of cluster analysis in wilderness disappearances. The cases are distributed across time and sometimes across jurisdictions, handled by different agencies, documented in different filing systems. Nobody, in the ordinary course of operations, is tasked with looking at them together. David Paulides looked at them together. His documentation of the Oregon cluster, in the context of his broader Missing 411 research, identified the specific 40-mile radius, the temporal spread across 5 decades, and the recurring characteristics that united cases that had otherwise been treated as entirely separate. The characteristics are by now familiar to anyone who has been following this series from the beginning. The absence of physical evidence of travel. Hunters, hikers, and a family passing through the area who disappeared without leaving the marks that human movement through terrain leaves. No broken branches, no disturbed ground, no tracks in the muddy stream crossings that anyone in this terrain must cross. People who entered and left no evidence of having been there. The recovery locations that did not make sense. 3 of the 5 recovered individuals in this cluster were found in terrain that had been searched previously. In 2 of those cases, the recovery location was in terrain that ground teams had covered within the preceding 48 hours. In one case, the recovery location was in a sector that had been searched twice. The condition of the recovered. The 3 survivors and the 2 recovered bodies in this cluster showed physical presentations that investigating personnel found difficult to explain consistently. Weight loss that did not correspond to the duration of the disappearance. Clothing intact after days or weeks in rough terrain. And in the 2 deaths, injuries that were ambiguous, not the specific injuries that a fall or a drowning or an exposure event produces, but injuries that the medical examiners documented with language that suggests they were not entirely certain what they were looking at. And the 6 who were never found, 6 people, entered a 40-mile radius of southern Oregon terrain, were searched for by trained personnel with dogs and aircraft and ground teams, were never located, not a trace. The terrain itself requires description. It is not dramatic wilderness. It will not appear in the kind of outdoor magazine that celebrates landscape. It is working forest, or was, before the timber industry finished with it. Some of what this terrain looks like now is the result of clear-cut operations that ended in the 1980s and 1990s, leaving behind the specific scarred landscape of logged-over ground. Young trees, growing in dense, messy competition where old growth once stood. Slash piles that have decomposed into tangles of debris. Roads that were built for log trucks and then abandoned when there was nothing left to haul. Interspersed with this logged-over landscape are sections of older forest that were not cut, too steep, too rocky, too remote for economical harvest. These sections feel different from the surrounding terrain. Darker, quieter. The canopy is full enough to suppress the understory, so the ground beneath the old trees is surprisingly open. You can move through it without the constant battle with brush that the logged-over sections require. These older sections are where most of the disappearances have occurred, not in the logged-over terrain, not on the forest roads, not in the areas that human activity has reshaped. In the older, darker, quieter sections that were left when everything around them was changed. This is worth noting, not as an explanation, but as a characteristic. The cluster does not simply reflect the presence of wilderness. It reflects something about specific sections of that wilderness. the ones that remained when everything around them was transformed, the ones that were left alone. A retired Forest Service employee who spent 22 years working in and around this terrain is the person who has done the most to document what the official record does not capture about this cluster. She is in her early 60s now. She did not begin her career as a researcher. She was a wildlife biologist, someone who understood this landscape in functional terms, who could tell you what species used, which habitat types, what the population dynamics of the deer and elk were, what the forest succession looked like after the logging had stopped. She was a scientist in the practical sense of someone whose understanding of a place was built on years of systematic observation. She did not begin keeping informal notes about the disappearances until the third one that she was aware of. The first two she had noted as tragic accidents. The third was when she began to wonder. What she noticed first was the terrain. She knew this specific terrain well enough to recognize the locations of the disappearances as unusual. Not unusual in the sense of being dangerous or difficult. Some of this ground was mild by wilderness standards. Unusual in the sense that they were in the wrong places for accidents to happen. Too accessible for someone to simply vanish from. Too close to roads and trails for a person to go missing without leaving a trace. She began, informally, to track the cases. She did not have access to the official records. She gathered information the way people who are paying close attention gather information, through conversations with rangers and deputies, through her own field observations, through the specific knowledge that comes from spending enough time in a place to know what it looks like when something is different. What she found over years of this informal tracking confirmed what she had suspected when she began. The cluster was real. The characteristics were consistent, and the specific sections of terrain where the disappearances concentrated were sections she already knew from her biological work as areas where animal behavior was sometimes unusual. She described this to the researcher carefully. She said, "In wildlife biology, we note places where animal behavior deviates from the expected pattern, where prey animals avoid terrain that should be good habitat, where predators don't follow prey into specific areas, where the behavioral signatures of the animals tell you something about the place that your instruments can't." She said, "Those areas in this terrain, the ones where the animal behavior was unusual, and the areas where the disappearances happened, they overlap." She said this with the measured tone of someone reporting an observation, not drawing a conclusion. She was careful about the distinction. She said, "I'm not telling you what that means. I don't know what it means. I'm telling you what I found." The cases between 1974 and the present fall into two categories. Those where something was recovered, a survivor, a body, and those where nothing was recovered at all. The 1981 case involved a family of 3 who stopped at a roadside pullout in the southern section of the cluster area during a cross-country drive. The parents stepped out to stretch. Their 9-year-old son stepped out with them. The parents were back in the car within minutes. Their son was gone. A search began within the hour. He had been visible to both parents until the moment he wasn't. There was no dramatic disappearance, just the ordinary way a child moves from view in outdoor environments. He had been 20 meters from the car. He was found 6 hours later in older forest terrain, uninjured. No explanation for how he had reached the location where he was found. He said he had been following something, but could not say what. He was 9 years old. The deputy who interviewed him noted specific phrases in his field notes. Not frightened, just following. Very quiet. It didn't have a face exactly. The phrases were underlined once. Otherwise left without comment. The boy is in his early 50s now. He did not respond to the researcher's interview request. The 1986 case was a solo hiker whose body was recovered 7 weeks after his disappearance, in terrain that had been searched in the first week. The medical examiner listed cause of death as exposure. A deputy filed a supplementary note, never formally incorporated into the case record, that the body's condition was inconsistent in several specific ways with 7 weeks of outdoor exposure in that season's conditions. The note was filed. No follow-up action was taken. The 1999 case was a retired school teacher who was found alive 43 miles from her last known position after 6 days missing. Her boots showed minimal wear. She had no memory of the intervening time. She spoke with the researcher. She was measured and specific. She said, "Whatever happened to me, wherever I was, it was beautiful. I know that's not a useful description, but it's the truest one I have." She said this without apology, without the embarrassment that often accompanies testimony that sounds strange. She said, "I went in. Something happened. I came back. And the part in the middle was beautiful." She was quiet. Then she said, "That probably doesn't help you." The researcher said, "It helps more than you know. There is a drainage in the northern section of the cluster area that the Forest Service employee has visited many times over the years, not in connection with any specific disappearance case. None of the documented cases occurred precisely there, though 2 of them occurred in adjacent terrain. She has visited it because it is an area she has found herself returning to in the course of her biological work, drawn by the specific character of the habitat and by what she describes as a quality of the place that she has not been able to fully account for scientifically." She said, "It's old forest. The real old stuff. What's left of it. Big trees, open understory, that specific quiet you get when the canopy is full and there's nothing much growing on the ground below it." She said, "I've been in a lot of old forest in this region. This particular drainage has a quality that the others don't have. I've tried to quantify it in biological terms, and I can't. The species composition isn't different enough to explain it. The hydrology is similar to other drainages. The terrain isn't exceptional." She said, "It just has a quality, like a sound that's below what you can hear. You feel it rather than hear it." She said, "The animals feel it too. I've done transects through that drainage that should have produced consistent wildlife sign. They don't. The sign drops off when you enter the drainage and comes back when you leave it. Not completely. There are animals in there, but less than you'd predict from the habitat. And the ones that are there behave differently, more alert, moving differently." She said, "I've talked to hunters who know this drainage, the ones who've been in there. Most of them give it a wide berth now, not because of anything that happened to them there, just because of the feeling." She said, "I give it a wide berth too. I go in to do my work and I come out. I don't linger." The researcher asked if she had ever had an experience there that she couldn't account for. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've had several experiences in the field over 22 years that I couldn't account for. That specific drainage is where most of them happened. The researcher waited. She said, I'd rather not describe them. They're mine, but they're part of why I started tracking the cases. She said, it's not separate for me. The cases and what I've experienced in that terrain. They feel like they're describing the same thing from different angles. The researcher said, what thing? She said, I don't know. That's why I'm still trying to figure it out. The 6 who were never found. Their names are not given here. Their cases are in the public record under their own terms, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. What is given here is a description of what the official record contains and what it does not. It contains the details of their entry into the terrain, their vehicles when applicable, or the accounts of people who last saw them, their intended routes when those were known, the resources deployed in the search for them, and the duration of those searches. It does not contain what happened to them. They are in the record as absent, as people who entered a specific geography and did not come back and were not found. Their files contain a duration of search, a determination of suspended operations, and a status notation that in most jurisdictions reads as an open missing persons case. Open missing persons cases are administratively different from closed ones, but experientially very similar. They are cases where the paperwork has not changed because the information has not changed, where the absence is maintained in a file that accumulates no new pages. The families of the 6 who were never found know what that feels like. They have been carrying the specific weight of an open file for between 8 and 50 years, depending on the case. The weight does not decrease with time in the way that other kinds of grief can. It is the weight of not knowing, and not knowing does not resolve on its own. Several of the families have been told, informally off the record, that their cases were unusual, that the search had been thorough, that the result was unexpected. One family was told, by a deputy who had worked on the search and who called them years later for reasons he did not fully explain, that he had never stopped thinking about it. He said he wanted them to know that. He didn't say anything else. The Forest Service employee is still working. Not for the Forest Service, she retired 4 years ago. But she is still in the terrain, still keeping her informal notes, still tracking the pattern in the way that she has been tracking it for nearly 2 decades. She said, I know what an accident looks like. I know what a drowning looks like, and what a fall looks like, and what exposure looks like. I've been in this landscape long enough to know the range of things that can go wrong when people and wilderness interact. Most of what goes wrong has explanations that fit. She said, this doesn't fit. She said it without drama, without the performance of mystery or the implication that she was inviting anyone to draw the conclusions she herself had not drawn. She was simply making an observation that 22 years of field experience had led her to. The terrain produces what it produces. The cases reflect what the terrain produces. The pattern is consistent and documented and real. What produces the pattern is the question she is still sitting with, has been sitting with, for a long time. This is where Arc 1 of this series comes to rest. Not with answers, with the weight of 5 episodes of accumulated evidence. 5 individual cases from different states, different landscapes, different demographics, different decades, and one geographic cluster that shows the same characteristics across 11 cases spanning half a century. The characteristics are consistent across all of it. The impossible recovery locations, the dogs that stop at specific points and will not continue, the survivors who cannot account for the time they were missing or the distance they traveled, the physical presentations that don't match the duration of the disappearance, the 6 who were never found, and beneath all of it, running through the documentation and the informal notes and the private conversations of the people who have worked these cases for years, the sense that the terrain is doing something, that specific places are producing specific outcomes with a consistency that exceeds what accident and misfortune and the ordinary cruelty of wilderness should produce. The series has been building a shape. In the next arc, it will begin examining that shape directly, not the individual cases. Those will continue to appear because the cases are the evidence, but the pattern that connects them, the recurring geography, the geological and environmental signatures that appear consistently in the cluster zones, the ways in which independent researchers working from different methodological starting points have been converging slowly on the same terrain features, the same environmental conditions, the same specific quality of wrongness. The pattern has a shape. In the episodes that follow, this series will try to describe that shape, without pretending to know what produces it, without pretending that the cases, placed side by side, resolve into an explanation, but without pretending either that they are simply a collection of unrelated accidents. They are not. Something is happening in these specific places, something that the evidence documents without explaining, something that the mountains and the forest and the specific configurations of water and rock that appear again and again in this documentation seem to enable. What it is, what it wants, what the 6 who were never found encountered at the end of what they could tell us. The series does not know. It is still looking into the specific places where the terrain goes quiet and the animals turn away, and the maps have almost nothing to say. There is one last detail about the Oregon cluster that deserves space before this arc closes. The Forest Service employee, the retired wildlife biologist who has been tracking the cases informally for nearly 2 decades, was asked near the end of her conversation with the researcher whether she had ever considered writing any of this down, whether she had ever considered making her observations formal. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've thought about it. Every few years I think about it again, about what it would look like to write it up properly, to treat it the way I treat any other field observation that deserved documentation." She said, "And then I think about who would receive it, what framework they would try to fit it into, what the response would be from the people who would have to engage with it officially." She said, "And I decide not to, not yet, maybe not ever." The researcher asked, "Why not yet?" She said, "Because I don't know enough yet. I've been watching this terrain for 22 years, and I still don't have a good description of what I'm watching. I have the observations. I have the cases. I have what I've experienced in that specific drainage. But I don't have language for it that wouldn't immediately trigger the dismissal that comes before anyone actually looks at the evidence." She said, "The language doesn't exist yet, or if it does, I haven't found it." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Maybe that's what you're doing, building the language. The researcher said, maybe. She said, I hope so, because someone needs to, because the cases keep happening, and the terrain keeps holding what it holds. And the 6 who never came back are still out there somewhere, in a geography that has no language and has never needed one to do what it does.